Our scripture reading this morning from 1 Samuel chapter 26. We'll read a portion of the main section of the chapter. It's another occasion where David is given an opportunity, if you like, to kill the king. And Saul, in his relentless pursuit of David, has discovered where he is and has brought his men, his 3,000 specially selected men, to seek out David. And we'll take up the text as we find it there in verse 6 of 1 Samuel chapter 26. And this is God's word. Then David said to Ahimelech the Hittite, and to Joab's brother Abishai, son of Zeruiah, who will go down with me into the camp to Saul? And Abishai said, I will go down with you. So David and Abishai went to the army by night. And there lay Saul sleeping within the encampment with his spear stuck in the ground at his head. And Abner and the army lay around him. Then Abishai said to David, God has given your enemy into your hand this day. Now please let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of his spear, and I will not strike him twice. But David said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? And David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. But take now the spear that is at his head and the jar of water, and let us go. So David took the spear and the jar of water from Saul's head, and they went away. No man saw it or knew it, nor did any awake, for they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. Then David went over to the other side and stood far off on the top of the hill, with a great space between them. And David called to the army and to Abner, the son of Ner, saying, will you not answer, Abner? Then Abner answered, who are you who calls to the king? And David said to Abner, are you not a man? Who is like you in Israel? Why then have you not kept watch over your lord the king? For one of the people came in to destroy the king your lord. This thing that you have done is not good. As the Lord lives, you deserve to die, because you have not kept watch over your Lord, the Lord's anointed. And now see where the king's spear is, and the jar of water that was at his head. Saul recognized David's voice and said, is this your voice, my son, David? And David said, it is my voice, my Lord, O king. And he said, why does my Lord pursue after his servant? For what have I done? What evil is on my hands? Now therefore let my lord the king hear the words of his servant. If it is the Lord who has stirred you up against me, may he accept an offering. But if it is men, may they be cursed before the Lord. For they have driven me out this day, that I should have no share in the heritage of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods. Now therefore let not my blood fall to the earth away from the presence of the Lord. For the king of Israel has come out to seek a single flea, like one who hunts a partridge in the mountains. Amen. We'll leave the passage there, and we'll look at the passage as a whole in a little while. How would you describe yourself in terms of patience? Are you a patient person? How is your patience? And I think if we're honest and realistic, we can become impatient very, very easily. After all, we live in often hectic and busy times and days, and we expect things to happen quickly. We expect when we turn on a light switch, that the lights will come on. Or if we turn on the television, that the television will come on. And if nothing happens, like the computer not doing what it's supposed to be doing, then we get frustrated and impatient. And I'm no different. One of my main hobbies, as many of you know, is photography, and particularly landscape photography. Now, I've done photography since I was 20 years of age, and I've done weddings, and I've done portraits, and I've done lots of photography with people. And that can be quite a fast pace, especially if you're doing a wedding. You've got one opportunity often to take the right photograph, and if you miss it, well, you've missed it. You can't redo it. But I like landscape photography because it allows me to take time in finding the right location, composing the shot that I want, and setting it up, and even having to wait for the right lighting to appear. And that can sometimes take quite a time. And to have time to think through the process is clearly beneficial for the end result. In other words, landscape photography for me teaches me to be patient. And that's what I want us to think about in our passage here in 1 Samuel 26. Because we find the patience of David being further tested in terms of his journey, which is, in a number of years now, his journey to go to be king of Israel. So I want us to first of all think about wondering. Now, if you were here a number of weeks ago and you were here when we were looking at chapter 24, you'll think this is almost a mirror of what happened in chapter 24 when David and his army were in the cave and Saul comes in to relieve himself and there was an opportunity to kill the king, and of course David didn't. So we've got a lot of similarities here. Saul has been told, and this is in the first few verses of the chapter, Saul's been told where David is, and so he musters his 3,000 specially chosen men to hunt him, just like he did in chapter 24. And David is given this opportunity to kill Saul, while all the army, Saul's army, are asleep. But he doesn't, and takes a trophy, just like he did with the corner of Saul's robe in chapter 24. And David then confronts Saul and says how he could easily have killed him. And he stands there holding the trophies in his hands. And Saul again, like in chapter 24, is humbled. And throughout all of this, David must have wondered, when am I going to become king? All this opposition against me and the opportunities for me to kill the king, and I can't because he's the Lord's anointed. How long is this going to go on? And you would think that this second opportunity to kill Saul, he would have been strongly tempted to do so. Indeed, Abishai, who volunteers to accompany him down to Saul's camp, clearly saw this as a God-given opportunity. If you look at verses 7 and 8. So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and early Saul, sleeping with the encampment, with his spear stuck in the ground at his head, and Abner and the army lay around him. Then Abishai said to David, God has given your enemy into your hand. Now please, let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear, and I will not strike him twice, meaning that he would kill him on the first go. But of course, David relents. David said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? The temptation must have been strong for David. You need to understand that. But because of his faith, because of his trust in God, because of perhaps the last occasion in chapter 24 as well, he doesn't allow Abishai to kill the king. But he must have continued to wonder when his time was going to come, when he would eventually be king over Israel. Because Saul was just on his own track. He was doing his own thing here. He wasn't bothered about Israel. He was only bothered about getting rid of David. And as you look back on your life, or perhaps you find yourself presently in a situation and you're wondering, when is something going to happen? The temptation is always going to be there to presume because of a circumstance that happens, or you jump the gun. That temptation can be very strong because In this instant age, we want things to happen right away, don't we? And as I've said before, an open door is not necessarily the door that God wants you to go through. If an opportunity like that was always a signal to act, then there would be no need for principles. At the very least, every opportunity needs to be tested. Wonder. Next, to think about wisdom. Because in determining God's will for us, we have to be prepared to test everything. It says in 1 Thessalonians 5, test everything, hold fast to what is good, abstain from every form of evil. And David here, having learned from the previous occasion, and because it would be evil for him to murder the king, he knows he has to refrain from any evil intentions. Verse 10. And David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, for his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. You see what he's saying there? He's saying, Saul's life is in God's hand. God may strike him, or he may come to die in his own time or whenever, or he will go into battle and perish. But it's up to God when Saul dies, not up to me. And that was wise action on his part compared to that of Abishai. David controlled the temptation, and in so doing, wisdom showed him an alternative. Second part of verse 11. But take now the spear that is at his head and the jar of water, and let us go. 1 Corinthians 10:13. I've used this verse many times here. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. So don't ever think that if you're tempted in a weird way, that's unique to you. Don't ever think that. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. And we see that godly wisdom in action here, because David, having been strengthened by the previous occasion, resists the temptation, and because he resists the temptation, he sees the way out that God has provided. Just think about it. If David had allowed Abishai to kill the king, that, I'm sure, well, especially as we will see, because the Lord had caused them all to fall into a deep sleep. But if David had killed, or Abishai had killed the king, undoubtedly David would have been arrested and killed. But no, he didn't yield to that temptation. And notice how God wonderfully did his part. Verse 12. So David took the spear and the jar of water from Saul's head, and he went away. No man saw it or knew it, nor did any awake, for they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. And we can only presume that if David had yielded to the temptation, then the people would have been aroused from a deep sleep. And temptation is always strong for the believer. If it wasn't strong, then it wouldn't be much of a temptation, would it? And temptation can be so strong that we think, I can't resist this. But note this, God is always stronger. God is always stronger than the temptation. That's the truth. And we simply have to learn to believe that and to apply that wisdom as David did here. And the fact is that amidst all this wondering by David, or ourselves in our own circumstances, the delay in an apparent answer or fulfillment only strengthens our faith and patience, provided we apply biblical wisdom. One thing to remember, whenever you pray about something with a request, there's 3 possible answers to your prayer. One is yes, I will give you what you ask. Another is no, you're not getting that. And the other is wait. Wait. And faith has to be cultivated like seeds in the soil. And it takes time along with the application of the right care and the right conditions for the seed to grow. And like David, we may not realize this at the time, but the flowers of faith will bloom given time and the right conditions and so on. And what we see here is David's boldness as he then stands up on the hill and confronts Abner, who was responsible for guarding the king. Verse 13, David went over to the other side and stood far off on the top of the hill with a great space between them, and he calls on them. And it seems that so deep was the sleep that God had given to all Saul and his army that David had a job rousing them. Because look at verse 14. David called to the army and to Abner the son of Ner, saying, "Will you not answer, Abner?" It's as if David had been shouting and nobody was responding to him. And then he taunts Abner for his carelessness in guarding the king. In fact, he declares that such negligence is worthy of death. And he displays Saul's spear and jug as evidence. Verse 15, David said to Abner, "Are you not a man? Who is like you in Israel? Why then have you not kept watch over your lord the king? For one of the people came in to destroy the king your lord. This thing that you have done is not good. As the Lord lives, you deserve to die, because you have not kept watch over your lord, the Lord's anointed. And now see where the king's spear is. The jar of water was at his head." David's wisdom. Why next? And David, throughout all of this period in his life, he must have been puzzled at the Lord's anointed Saul in his continued determination to kill him. Why? 2 attempts with a spear when he was a minstrel for the king. Spear that he was now holding in his hand. Followed by this relentless mission and pursuit by Saul after David. Why? Why this continued pursuit? Especially when David had showed him no harm on the previous occasion in the cave, and indeed here. Well, this is what David asks the king, who has now been roused from his sleep. Verse 18. And he said, "Why does my Lord pursue after his servant? For what have I done? What evil is on my hands?" And then he presents Saul with a twofold answer to the question, to his question, verse 19. "Now therefore let my lord the king hear the words of his servant. If it is the Lord who has stirred you up against me, may he accept an offering. But if it is men, may they be cursed before the Lord, for they have driven me out this day, that I should have no share in the heritage of the Lord, saying, Go serve other gods." In other words, what David is saying to David in response to his question, "Why are you doing this?" Was this God that had instructed this? Or was it men? Saul knows the answer to that one. It's obvious, according to David. He says in verse 20, "Now therefore let not my blood fall to the earth away from the presence of the Lord, for the king of Israel has come out to seek a single flea, like one who hunts a partridge in the mountains." And Saul, of course, when he realizes what David is saying, he's humbled. Of course he's humbled. Verse 21, "I have sinned. Return, my son David, for I will no more do you harm, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Behold, I have acted foolishly and have made a great mistake." And that's quite an admission by Saul. I suppose in some ways he couldn't do anything else. Now the question why is a question that's often on our lips. There are so many things in life that we do not understand. So many things that we want the answers to, and when we don't get an answer, then it can be frustrating, at least. And none more so than when we want to know God's will for us. Because that's what the Christian life is about. It's about discovering God's will. And we kind of would like it, I suppose, if he just supernaturally just laid it all out in a plan for us. But it's not like that. It's a journey of faith, a journey of discovering God's will. And that involves searching and testing. And it leads to this final point, that of waiting. Waiting. Specifically, waiting on the Lord. Waiting on God's time. God's time. We want everything done today or yesterday. But only God sees the bigger picture. And make no mistake, we've all got a part to play in God's bigger picture. And if we can't see the big picture, then we can't know specifically what our part in that is until God opens the door for us or shows us the way. Well, by this time, David knew beyond doubt that he was going to become king. He had been anointed to become king by Samuel, but it would be in God's time. And he'd had a number of verbal confirmations by individuals. Jonathan, back in chapter 23, Abigail in chapter 25, and even from Saul himself on the previous occasion in chapter 24. And it's one of the practical truths that David expresses in the Psalms that he wrote. There are no fewer than 17 verses in the Psalms that refer to waiting on the Lord, 13 of which were written by David. And let me read one example. This is Psalm 37, verses 7 to 9. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Fret not yourselves over the one who prospers in his way, over the man who carries out evil devices. Think Saul here. Refrain from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not yourself, it tends only to evil. For the evildoers shall be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land. Twice he refers in those 3 verses to waiting on the Lord. And it's clear that these years for David on the run from Saul were a period of learning to wait on God and his timing. Furthermore, waiting on God only strengthens a person spiritually. And of course, David was going to need a lot of spiritual strength when he did become king, in great measure there. Now, we don't always appreciate the significance of the hard and the difficult times that we face in life. We prefer to avoid them. And sometimes we actually do try to avoid them. Yeah. But in God's plan for us, times of testing are times of bringing the impurities within us to the surface, for God to skim them off, just like gold in the purification process. In other words, God knows best. Who are we to think that we know best what God's will for us is? God is the one who knows. He has a plan for us. And that's why we have to learn to wait for his time. For that moment when it will become abundantly clear, this is the way, walk ye in it. James, in his epistle, in the opening of it in chapter 1, verse 2, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. That's something, isn't it? Count it all joy. But it's because God is working out his purposes in us. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness or perseverance. And let steadfastness or perseverance have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So, As David was being purified in the long testing process and humbly waiting for God to act when God was going to act, so too for us. We need to go through that testing, purifying process so that God is making us more and more like Christ. And truth be known, in these fast-paced days that we live in, waiting on God seems to be contrary to the expectations of 21st century lifestyle. Now, of course, waiting on God does not mean doing nothing. Like, I'm waiting on God, well, I'll just go to bed and just rest and just take it easy. That would be careless, that would be lazy. If we truly are desiring to be followers of Jesus Christ, we have to make sure that we are walking daily with him, keeping our prayer life active, keeping our Bible study active, keeping our fellowship and witness very much alive. Because if we're not walking with the Lord, then we're walking on our own. Now, in closing, I want us to notice how David graciously responds to Saul's confession, verse 22. And David answered and said, "Here is the spear, O king. Let one of the young men come over and take it. The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness, for the Lord gave you into my hand today, and I will not put out my hand against the Lord's anointed." And even though this was actually the last time that David and Saul would ever meet. And of course, David did not know at this point what Saul might try to do in the future. But he was simply showing that here that he was entrusting himself to God by doing the right thing. And so he gives him back his spear and his water jug. I meant you no harm. I just want you to know that I am trusting God in all of this, whatever your plans might be. And here's the spear with which you tried to kill me twice. I'm giving it back to you. That's amazing. And such gracious action in the face of an enemy is powerful. It's a powerful challenge to us in our dealings with those who might hate us. Because let's face it, these days, Christian principles are hated by some of the culture that's developing in our world today. We've got to remember that. If people direct hatred towards us, what's our response? What's the temptation is to be hateful back to them? No. We've got to love even our enemies and respect them for their choices. And in so doing, we could say with David, as he says in verse 24, "Behold, as your life was precious this day in my sight, so may my life be precious in the sight of the Lord, and may he deliver me out of all tribulation." I think it's interesting, he says, as your life, this is to Saul, as your life was precious this day in my sight. And that's how we should treat people. Other people, whoever they are, no matter what they think of us, their life should be precious in our sight. Why? Because everyone's life is in God's hand. God's hands. And we respect God. We love God by loving his creation, humanity. Let's have a word of prayer. Loving God and keeper of our souls, may how we praise and thank you for your purposes and your ways. We understand from this text and your word in general that your ways are not ours, and how we have to go through your testing process to discover your ways for us. Thank you for your love and your patience with us as we struggle through our faith journey. Keep us faithful and true to you always. And we ask all this in Jesus our Saviour's